Join me, Harriet Gould, for the Lab Matters podcast to hear fascinating stories every week from the inspiring people behind the science. Join me in this episode of Lab Matters as I speak to journalist and trustee of the Science Museum, Sarah Sands, about the work she does behind the scenes to champion science. Today we have with us journalist and serial advocate Sarah Sands. Sarah, thank you so much for coming. Now, you were the editor of the Sunday Telegraph, the Evening Standard, and the Today programme on BBC Radio 4. Since then, you've been at the British Council and you're a partner at Hawthorne Advisors. You're also an honorary fellow of your alma mater Goldsmiths, University of London, and of Lucy Cavendish, Cambridge. And you sit on the G7 Gender Equality Advisory Council, which you chaired in 2001. And then I don't want to carry on, but I have to because you've done so much. So to mop up any free time you might have had, we come to the reason that I invited you to the Lab Matters podcast. You've been beavering away as an advocate for the science sector, as a trustee of the Science Museum, which I'm imagining gives you a unique insight into one of the best-known public-facing science institutions. And you convene the Braemar Science Summit, which is, I guess, effectively an engine room where you invite leaders to discuss policy, innovation, and the future of this sector in the national context. But before we go into any of that, which I'm quite looking forward to doing, can we track back a bit? You went to school in Cambridge and you went to college in Kent, and I just wondered if you remembered or what you remembered about how you viewed science in those days.
Well, I'm not sure I viewed anything, but I was not a model pupil, I have to say, which is partly why I'm trying to catch up very, very late on with I have so much to learn. So and actually talking about the beauty of the Science Museum, I did take my 4-year-old grandson there this week, and the moment where he was looking at it's usually space, that's usually the blockbuster, but actually in their Wonder Lab, just watching him understand the sort of playfulness of science. So whether it was pendulums or it was making little paper planes that then understand sort of forces of and actually it would, and to see a face just alight with with science, and to see that replicated across the Science Museum, it's absolutely heaving. It was probably peak day holidays, but was so moving, and so I felt that it was everything that I should have, that should have been me. And I'm afraid I was a perfectly good education, which I didn't make much of, and so science at school was quite fun, trying to blow up Bunsen burners. I think that was and actually nature walks was a thing that I remember being in the Kent countryside, and still there is something about that spring walk that's still, so I guess that's about as far as I got. So I'm afraid there was no Einstein in the making.
So it's interesting, really, that despite not having any fire lit underneath you at that point, that things have changed around now. But not immediately. First, you went into journalism, but you didn't leap straight into editorship. How did you get there?
Well, it was quite an old-fashioned slog, which you wouldn't have to do now. So my route was local newspapers, shorthand, court reporting, so all those old forgotten skills. And then I was and in terms of understanding science, I guess one illustration, which is very much to my discredit, was once I got to the Telegraph, and I'd met then the science editor, who was called Roger Highfield, who's become a great friend. And so the first conversation I had with him was walking over from the news desk and saying that Gwyneth Paltrow had said that the sky was lower in the UK than in California, could that be true? And could he write 700 words? And he was very game about it. And actually, he was someone who has made science work in a rather sort of joyful, playful way. I think he was writing books about how Father Christmas could have delivered all those presents and so on. So the science behind Father Christmas. Actually, he's just published a book that's done very well this year, which is very much on topic about digital twins, the digital you. So it's so he's sort of on top of science, but always seeing how it can be made accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Although accessible is a rather sort of dreary word. It's I think it's how to make it joyful is a better way of putting it.
You're right. Accessible is overused, isn't it, in a way?
Hmm.
And it's so interesting actually, because making science content work in the context of a national title, you know, it can't be like a scientific journal. You need
Well,
to
that's the thing, and that it's always it tends to oversimplify because you need a headline. And I remember Paul Nurse saying that it was a great luck that when he was working on stem cell research, which in the end, you know, got him the Nobel Prize, he was working with yeast, and so he knew that would never be of any interest to news media because no one's going to talk about yeast research, you know. So I think, funnily enough, science now is probably coming slightly closer to the demands of a newspaper. That I noticed Patrick Vallance giving a talk, and I think he'd used the term about the age of the cure. And of course, that's something everyone, you know, newspapers are always saying, cure found, you know, for the one that used to just drive scientists mad was the cure for the cold. You cannot find a cure for the cold. But anyway, it is now actually scientific advance in you know, medicine, and obviously all through technology, seems so fast now that it is becoming quite journalistic, I think.
Yeah, you're right, especially during the pandemic.
Yes. Yeah. And actually the pandemic was, you mentioned the Braemar Summit, and that came out of on the back of the pandemic. And I was talking to Roger Highfield, who I by now become quite close to, and said that it was so astonishing that the way that science had, you know, just brought us out of what seemed like a kind of age of darkness, that it felt like an you know, a new enlightenment. And do you think we should just celebrate science in some way? So we spoke to You Inventors, who's Hauser and Wirth. So there's a rather beautiful hotel in Braemar, but there's also this village hall, and so it's beautiful, and it's in the middle of nowhere. And then coming out of a bus was just this sort of groups of, you know, Nobel Prize winners, the people who had the AstraZeneca crowd, Dame Sarah Gilbert, and so on, and all the locals who would quite used to the royals being there and so on. So it, you know, it wasn't that they weren't used to seeing people of celebrity, but were all lining up, you know, to sort of to see these people. And so they were, of course, you know, superstars for that year. And I think that that's where everyone did start to appreciate just how important science is in terms for the public. That
it's interesting that you said about one of the journalists saying that you can't cure the human cold, and this cure notion has just gone on, and you know, seemingly we need a cure for everything. And I just wonder if you have an opinion on how that tracks with saving the planet and the environmental aspect of science, and how the number of humans living longer is impacted.
Yes, and it's interesting. In fact, the Braemar summit this year, we're really looking at longevity and everything that means. And it's interesting that while we say science is a cause of pure celebration, and I do believe that, but actually on that first year, even when we had the vaccine, there were some sort of warning voices. I think Jeanette Winterson was one, on just that you need a little bit of humility as well, because this sense that we can solve everything and that we are the masters. And I think that was something that the king, or prince as he was at the time, was something that he obviously identified about the Industrial Revolution, so on, that we see it as pure progress. It was also, fossil fuels and sort of climate destruction. And so whenever we do, so you have to be careful with innovation. Even now we're saying, oh, the technology is so sort of brilliant, just the sheer energy being used and the resources that are going to be needed for that. It's something that we tend to overlook. And even, the pandemic, of course, it was brilliant that the vaccine came and so on. You're now still looking at all those sort of piles of masks and PPE everywhere. It's just, and all the turtles being throttled by it, and just the sheer waste that we produce. So I think that is something that we've tried to bring into Braemar and actually into a general conversation, is that how much the progress can't just be at the cost of the planet. We have to share the planet. I think that's a simple point, isn't it?
Yes, we're not moving to Mars just yet.
No. Why would you want to be? So again, it's the thing is that progress, and now let's move to Mars. And then you actually looking at the Science Museum this week, in the section with the planets, and that you suddenly see this planet of such sort of beauty, and you think, oh, that's ours, that. So responsibility for the planet, I think, obviously is trumps everything.
What do you reckon the best thing that you covered was when you were, well, maybe on the Today programme? What do you think was?
Well, I guess what was interesting about the Today programme, as you say, is that it's a brilliant programme. It was very focused on politics and sort of hard news, and science was always seen as sort of something else. And I did feel, coming from newspapers, actually, that that you could have a bit of breadth in the way you do with newspapers, that actually you need a bit of diversity in the sort of stories that you run. And that the thing about science is that it's something that we should understand. It is actually, climate needs to be news. You can't just say, oh, well, it's just happening too far away. It's happening now. And that it is a chance to learn, and it also slightly changes the tone of the program from being what used to annoy some of the listeners of being over adversarial. It's much more difficult for presenters to do those devastating interviews with scientists, because they probably know much less than they're with the politicians. It's a kind of engagement of a battle that they both understand. But with scientists, there was a little bit of humility used to creep into those voices, which I always enjoyed. John Humphreys, actually, who was there when I was there, and almost, it was the moment where the sort of fourth wall, disappeared, because he had to say, I don't understand this, could you explain it to me? And it was a sort of rather wonderful thing to hear. So I think the great moment of realizing actually how important science was, although we did special programs where you paid, we did one on space and so on. But I think it was when Stephen Hawking died. And the other thing about the Today programme, although it is the morning news programme, not that it's rare that news has just happened. You're kind of looking ahead to something, or so sometimes it happens. The election might be overnight. You might have a disaster overnight. Celebrity deaths are the other thing, and with him it was realizing how much it mattered, and we did just sort of throw out everything and just make it a almost the whole program about Stephen Hawking and how many people there were to talk about him. And then you just realized how much it mattered, you know. So I still look back, and actually the ratings were fantastic for that program. And so I think it was realizing that science actually really is at the heart of things in the way that we don't always appreciate, you know, that when you talk about news, a lot of it is fleeting, whereas, you know, there was everything that Stephen Hawking represented, you know, is humbling, you know.
Lab Matters is brought to you by the award-winning temperature control equipment from Polyscience, available worldwide. Polyscience, changing the world of temperature control forever. That's such a good point. Now, I think it, just before we move on, I just think it's so nice to know that there's someone really championing everything in the science sector behind the scenes in this national context. I think that it's very encouraging from my perspective, because all the specialist titles and organizations do it, but to have a champion, I'm sure you're not the only one, but nevertheless,
well, I guess it's someone not being qualified. It was something Paul Nurse, when he wrote his book, What is Life? And I said, you know, that I'd loved it. And actually I'd understood. And he went, I know, because I wrote it for people like you know, with a big smile on his face. So I think, and he once said that he did think actually that the great, my great strength was not being a scientist, so that I can say, so that I can translate some of it, I guess, and be a cheerleader outside a group of people. Of course, they all know how important they are to each other, but it doesn't always translate into the wider world.
That's it, exactly. So onto your big cheerleading piece, the Braemar Summit. You know, I keep calling it that, but it's not going to be in Braemar this year. It's changed its name?
It's only because of those pesky politicians. So because there's almost certainly going to be an election in the autumn. And the point about Braemar is I think that works is the mix of things, so that you get the scientists and thinkers and policymakers and entrepreneurs, you know, investors, and you put them together. And it's the conversations that can come out of that. There was one I was particularly pleased about, which was he was a Ukrainian scientist at Oxford, a friend called Vlad, who's working on neuroscience, but on sleep and hibernation. And the reason he's doing that is because he says you will need to hibernate if you're getting to Mars. It's the only way you'll be able to get there. It's otherwise beyond human capability. So he had struck up, and you can see people, you know, walking up and down the river with their sort of hands behind their back, you know, deep in these conversations with these different disciplines. So he was there with David Cameron discussing dementia, and by the end of it, you know, they had all sorts of ideas and projects that they could sort of follow up. So it's something about the serendipity of those conversations. And then actually the other thing we will miss from Braemar was Rachel Johnson leading everyone into the freezing waters, which of course it did turn out that actually the session that we had on dementia, but and the brain and the limits or the potential and so on. And it did turn out that though there's terrific work going on about proteins and so on, it's cold water swimming. You know, you just have to go and dip your head, and it may do for your heart, but it will probably help your brain.
Well, yeah, well, that's a balance that we all have to strike.
Brain
or heart.
That's absolutely right. Yes, that's another conversation. Actually, the arts and science will come to that.
Well, you're keeping your brain nicely active. I think you're of course doing all the advocacy stuff. Well, you have written books, but before we come on to that, I just want to find out just a little bit more about what you do with the Science Museum.
Well, I'm a trustee on the Science Museum, and so I that's a sort of a general role, and then specifically on a committee for the Science and Media Museum in Bradford, and then also sit on a digital advisory board. So that's very interesting, or committee. So that's an interesting one to see, with the reach of the museum of, how many visitors sort of versus those who can come to it digitally. And that gives you a sort of global audience and so on.
And is it
and I guess what I thought was so impressive was just the absolute sort of passion about education, so it's and actually, if you go into the Science Museum, especially during the school holidays, the sort of average age probably is not much more than 15, I would think, that it's a very young audience. And it is, so it's, so it's really discussing the challenges that might come up with actually things like the looking after the objects and the buildings themselves. There's a sense always of what more we can do, what more to bring science, and I think that is actually in the remit about sort of science capital, and how one serves the public in that way. So always just thinking how to make science as interesting and fun as possible while keeping, the scholarship. And it is marvelous to be amongst trustees who are proper scientists. And so again, it's those little fragments of conversations about, is one I think was whether the soul is in fact memories. That was one, that I just, oh, that's very Braemar. That's a very Braemar kind of conversation. So, and we have a new chair. We have who's Tim Lawrence, who's joined this year, and the director in Blatchford, who's fantastically sort of Tiggerish, and also actually that sense of how museums work globally within. So there's a big sort of thirst for exchanges and that kind of thing.
Mm. It sounds fascinating. And it really is encouraging knowing that so much work goes into it all. It really is. So there's one question that I'd like to ask before we go, but I'll ask you it now, but we'll talk about your books just for a minute before you answer it, just to give you a moment to think about it, because I don't want to put you on the spot too much. The question is, what are your hopes for the future of science? But now back to these books you've written
These
about
books,
hedgehogs. Tell me about this book about hedgehogs.
Well, the hedgehog book, and actually there is, again, one understands this sort of bathos of it, of that you're in amongst these trustees who have written books about the entire planet and so on, and then they go, oh, and Sarah's written a book too. What's your book about? Like, oh, it's hedgehogs. But it's a book about, a little book about sort of nature and loss as well. So it's as we know, the hedgehog is rather threatened. It's just a story of finding a hedgehog. There's quite a lot of there's quite a sort of body of work of poetry and a bit of philosophy and so on, Fox and the Hedgehog. And so it's a bit of an examination of that. And actually it was a sort of seasonal a book about hibernation and spring, really. And it just happened that I found this hedgehog with my grandson. We tried to save the hedgehog. We released the hedgehog in spring. At the same time, my father was very ill. I'd hoped he would make it to spring. And in fact, when we bought the hedgehog home and released it, was the night he died. And so in a way, it was a kind of a sort of release. So it's back to a bit of what we were talking about, mystery. Actually, it was a sort of strange, moonlit evening. The hedgehog was released. I don't know where the hedgehog went. I never saw the hedgehog after that. And when I asked a hedgehog expert, where on earth was the hedgehog, they said, oh, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And I thought that was a kind of,
How very comforting.
yes.
Nice. So that's the book, and if people search for it, they can just find it quite easily. Sarah Sands' Hedgehog book.
That's right. It's called something else. It's called Bristle and Faith or something. But anyway, okay, I actually can't remember what it's called. But anyway, yeah, can just find Sarah Sands hedgehogs.
Yep.
It'll come up.
Lovely.
And I was very delighted that you kind of you to list my accomplishments, but you missed the fact that I have since been made patron of Emma's Hedgehog
Oh,
Hospital.
I had no
It's
idea.
oh,
We need to update your Wikipedia
pity, I know.
Emma's Hedgehog
Hospital.
Hospital.
And
Right.
yes, so great pride in that.
Very good. Now back to that question,
Yes.
the final question before we run out of time. What's your vision? What are your hopes for the future of science?
Well, it's certainly above my pay grade to think about the whole future of science. I do think in Britain, it is very interesting to me and hopeful and exciting that we're very good at science, or they're very good at, other Britons are very good at science, and so I think that the what I'd like to see so I think politicians tend to be hyperbolic about world beating this and best at this, but I think genuinely in science it's where we are a world leader. So I would love to see science given the kind of backing that it needs, that where there's excellence you take away all the obstacles. And actually I remember Sarah Gilbert who was behind the vaccine, of meeting her once. It was a very nice evening, but it wasn't one I felt she would automatically be comfortable within. It was a sort of luxury awards, and she's a rather marvelously sort of reserved and slightly stern looking, and but there she was enjoying the evening. And the reason she was there was because when she was trying to when she was wanting to do her research on the vaccine, you would, in order to get the grants, you have to fill in all your forms, and you have to go by a certain criteria and so on. Burberry just said, have a bunch of money and good luck, and that I know that doesn't entirely fit with a with sort of public accountability on funds, but actually that sense of just backing our people. I think that certainly there's a friend of mine who's always at the who's a sort of founding member of Braemar, called Rob Miller, who runs the Whittle Laboratory in Cambridge. And so they're trying to, and of course, Whittle, that was the jet engine. They got it. They would have got it sooner had they had the funds. And now they're trying for green aviation, and they probably could do it and do it before others, but they just need total backing. So I kind of feel it is the area that great to have private investment, but actually we don't want it's always I'm always a little sorry to see us come up with the great inventions and then it's sold off, so it would be marvelous. So there are things I'm watching that I know are world beating. There's a plant center, the John Innes plant center makes it sound like a garden center, but world beating plant research in Norwich. I think centers of excellence, beacons of excellence across the UK for science are enormously exciting. So that's how I'd like to see the future of science.
I think I'll get in line and champion that cause.
Yay!
Sarah, thank you so much. I can't believe you've managed to find time to be with us today, but we are very appreciative that you have.
No, thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed for asking me. Now I must go back to my pond to look for frogs, which is where we started. Have a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.